Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 728. We've lost both engines. I repeat, both engines have failed. The voice crackled through the old farm radio like a ghost trapped in metal, distorted by static and fear. Emily Harper froze in the middle of her wheat field, one hand still wrapped around a vintage gold microphone she used to check fence line frequencies during harvest season. Overhead, the sky that had been peacefully blue just seconds ago was now ripped open by a roaring white jet dragging thick black smoke across the horizon. It was flying too low, too wrong, too fast. "Control, do you copy? We have no thrust." The desperation in the pilot's voice didn't sound like Hollywood panic. It sounded like a father trying not to die. Emily swallowed hard. She wasn't air traffic control, she wasn't military, she wasn't even college educated. She was just a farmer in Kansas with dirt on her boots and wind in her hair. But the plane was descending toward her land, toward the empty fields that stretched for miles in every direction. If it missed the open farmland, it would hit the highway 6 miles east. School buses used that road every afternoon. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "I can hear you," she whispered into the microphone before she even realized she was speaking. The jet thundered overhead, engines coughing smoke like exhausted giants. She could see the landing gear stuck halfway down. Something inside her snapped into focus. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Flight 728, this is Harper Farm. You're over open land, miles of it. Stay west. Do you copy? Stay west. Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. For a moment there was only static. Then faintly, "Harper Farm, say again." The question wasn't whether she was qualified, the question was whether she was willing. And somewhere between the smoke and the silence, Emily Harper stopped being just a farmer. The first thing people misunderstand about rural America is how quiet it is. Not empty, quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the wind comb through wheat like fingers through hair. Emily had grown up in that quiet. After her father passed and her mother moved to Wichita, she stayed behind. 31 years old, running 400 acres alone, fixing tractors with YouTube tutorials and prayer. The radio she held that morning wasn't some dramatic prop. It was a leftover Aviation band receiver her dad had once used to monitor crop duster traffic. She kept it out of habit. Habits saved lives more often than heroics. When the jet first appeared, it wasn't dramatic. It was wrong. Too low for cruising altitude, too unstable. She saw the smoke before she understood it. Then came the Mayday call. Her instinct wasn't bravery, it was geography. She knew every mile of that land. The dry creek bed to the north, the flatter winter field to the west, recently harvested and hard-packed, the irrigation lines that would tear metal apart if the pilot misjudged. Flight 728, you're approaching County Road 12. Do not go east. Repeat, do not go east. That's highway traffic. Stay over the fields. You've got open ground for at least 3 miles westbound. She wasn't guessing, she was calculating in real time. The pilot's breathing filled the static. "We have minimal control." "Then aim for the darker patch," she said. "That's cleared land, no silos, no livestock. It's your best shot." The jet dipped lower. The sound wasn't cinematic, it was mechanical strain, metal screaming under pressure. Emily felt small beneath it, a speck against engineered power worth millions. Yet for the first time, that power sounded fragile. She wasn't fighting the plane. She was guiding it away from people who would never know her name. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. County response units, maybe state troopers. News would travel fast. A commercial jet losing both engines over Kansas farmland wasn't a small story. But none of them were here yet. It was just her in a cockpit full of strangers trusting a voice they couldn't see. "You're aligned," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her tone. "You're over my west field now. Keep your nose level. Don't fight it too hard." Silence stretched. Then the jet glided lower, impossibly low, until it skimmed the tops of wheat and disappeared beyond a slight ridge. The ground trembled. A deep, violent rumble rolled through the soil like thunder trapped underground. Emily closed her eyes. The impact came, not an explosion, but a grinding roar of metal carving earth. Dust rose in a massive cloud, swallowing the horizon. She ran toward it without thinking. That's when she saw the flashing red and blue lights cresting the dirt road. And that's when everything shifted. Because saving a plane was only half the story. By the time Emily reached the ridge, her lungs were burning and her boots were caked in mud. The jet lay tilted across her west field, its nose buried but largely intact, smoke rising in heavy waves. It hadn't exploded. It had landed. Against odds and gravity and probability, it had landed. Emergency slides were inflating. Passengers stumbled out, some crying, some clutching each other, all alive enough to move. Relief flooded her so hard she nearly dropped to her knees. Then she heard the shout, "Ma'am!" "Step back, hands where I can see them." She turned. A uniformed female police officer stood 10 yards away, stance rigid, both hands on her firearm, tactical vest, body cam blinking red, jaw tight with adrenaline and authority. "Put the microphone down now." For a split second, Emily didn't process it. She was still looking at the plane, at the people descending the slides. "I said drop it," the command snapped like a whip. Emily slowly lowered the gold microphone into the dirt and raised her hands. The officer approached carefully, eyes sharp, assessing. "Were you transmitting on emergency aviation frequency?" "Yes," Emily answered. "They couldn't reach tower. I was just—" "You interfered with an active aviation emergency?" The accusation landed heavier than the jet. "I guided them to open land," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If they'd gone east, that's not your call." The officer's tone wasn't cruel. It was procedural, controlled, built on years of training that prioritized containment over context. More cruisers arrived. Deputies secured the perimeter. Fire crews rushed past. No one looked at Emily as a hero. They looked at her as a variable, a civilian transmitting on restricted frequencies during a federal emergency. She felt the shift in power immediately. Minutes ago, pilots trusted her voice. Now she was being treated like a threat. "Turn around," the officer said, "for everyone's safety." The cold metal of handcuffs shocked her system more than the gun had. Around them, passengers were being counted, assessed, wrapped in blankets. News helicopters circled overhead. Cameras zoomed. Somewhere in that chaos, a narrative was forming, and she wasn't in control of it. "I was trying to help," she said quietly. The officer paused for half a heartbeat, just enough to reveal something human behind the badge, but procedure won. "That's not for you to decide," she replied. As Emily was escorted toward the cruiser, she glanced back at the jet carved into her land. Smoke still rose, but so did survivors. The field she'd planted in spring was destroyed. The crop insurance wouldn't cover this. Her savings were thin. And now she might be facing federal charges for unauthorized transmission. The irony settled heavy in her chest. She had spoken up when silence would have been safer, and now she was paying for it. But as the cruiser door shut and sirens echoed across the open Kansas sky, one thought refused to leave her mind: if I had stayed quiet, that highway would be covered in wreckage. And somewhere deep down, even beneath the fear, she knew she would make the same choice again. The inside of the county cruiser smelled like vinyl and heat, the kind that builds under a summer sun and settles into everything. Emily sat with her hands cuffed behind her back, staring out at her own land as deputies and federal responders swarmed it like ants around a fallen branch. The jet looked smaller now from a distance, almost harmless, which felt like a lie. News helicopters circled overhead, and she could already imagine the headlines forming without her voice in them. Unauthorized civilian interferes with emergency transmission. Rural woman disrupts aviation protocol. It didn't matter that the plane was intact. It didn't matter that no one had died. What mattered in the first official minutes of any crisis was control, and she had stepped into a space that wasn't supposed to belong to her. The female officer who had drawn her weapon stood a few feet away outside the cruiser, speaking into her radio with crisp efficiency. Her posture had shifted slightly, less combat-ready, more procedural, but she still carried that rigid certainty of someone trained to assume the worst first. Emily didn't hate her. She understood her in a way. When you're responsible for public safety, you look for threats before you look for heroes. The cruiser door opened again. "You're being detained pending federal review," the officer said, her voice calmer now. "The FAA and NTSB are en route. They'll want to know exactly what you transmitted and why." Emily nodded slowly. "You can pull the recordings," she said. "I didn't give them instructions outside the land layout. I told them where the open ground was. That's all." The officer studied her face for a long second as if trying to measure sincerity against protocol. "You're not licensed air traffic control," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Emily answered, "but I know my fields better than any map." There it was, the dividing line. Credential versus lived knowledge, authority versus proximity. The officer closed the door again, and for the first time since the plane had appeared in the sky, Emily felt the full weight of uncertainty. What if she had overstepped? What if in trying to help, she had made something worse? Doubt is loud when you're alone with it. An hour passed before a black SUV rolled up, federal insignia discreet but unmistakable. A man in a windbreaker stepped out, speaking quickly with the officer. They both glanced toward the cruiser. Emily straightened instinctively. The door opened, and this time the officer's expression wasn't sharp. It was complicated. "The cockpit voice recorder captured your transmission," she said. "The pilot's requesting to speak on your behalf." Emily blinked. "He is?" He said, and I'm quoting, "That voice saved us from hitting a highway full of people." The words landed slowly, like rain after drought. The officer uncuffed her without ceremony, but her movements had softened. "You'll still need to give a statement," she added, "but you're not under arrest." Emily stepped out of the cruiser, wrists aching, heart pounding in a different rhythm now. Around them, paramedics loaded the last passengers into ambulances for evaluation. No stretchers covered in sheets, no body bags, just shaken families clinging to one another. She caught sight of the cockpit crew standing near a fire truck. The pilot, mid-40s, uniform streaked with soot, looked at her across the field. Their eyes met for just a moment. He didn't salute. He didn't dramatize it. He just nodded once. Respect without spectacle. That was the midpoint. The moment the story could no longer turn back into something small. She hadn't just spoken into a radio. She had stepped into responsibility without permission and faced the consequences head-on. The power dynamic had shifted, not because she demanded it, but because the truth had forced its way into the narrative. The officer cleared her throat. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "most people freeze in a crisis." Emily looked at the torn earth where her wheat once stood. "I didn't have time to." The days after the landing felt stranger than the impact itself. Federal investigators mapped her field with laser precision. Insurance adjusters walked the torn soil with careful frowns. Reporters waited at the edge of her driveway, hungry for a version of the story that fit neatly into 30 seconds. Some called her a hero. Others questioned whether an untrained civilian should ever speak on emergency aviation bans. The debate grew louder than the engines had been. Emily stayed mostly quiet. She gave her official statement, described exactly what she had heard, exactly what she had said, and exactly why she had chosen West over East. Geography, not ego. Consequence, not courage. The female officer returned 2 days later, this time without sirens, without a weapon drawn. She stood at the edge of the ruined field, hat tucked under her arm. "I reviewed the footage," she said. "Body cam caught everything." Emily crossed her arms loosely, wary but composed. And I reacted by the book," the officer replied. "But sometimes the book doesn't show you the whole picture." It wasn't quite an apology. It was something harder, an acknowledgement. Authority had met humanity and adjusted. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the scar carved through acres of work. "They're saying the dual engine failure was due to bird strike at altitude," the officer added. "Total loss of thrust. The glide path you gave them bought critical seconds." Emily exhaled slowly. Those seconds had been everything. Not because they proved she was right, but because they proved she had understood the stakes. The FAA issued a public statement clarifying that while unauthorized transmissions are generally prohibited, extraordinary circumstances sometimes produce extraordinary outcomes. It wasn't praise. It wasn't condemnation. It was institutional language trying to hold nuance. Donations began arriving unexpectedly. Small checks from strangers across the country. Notes tucked inside thanking her for speaking when it mattered. She hadn't asked for any of it. The crop loss would take time to recover from, but the community showed up in ways that felt quiet and real. Tractors lined up one morning to help replant the damaged acres. No speeches, just work. The officer returned once more before the federal teams left town. "You know," she said, looking out over the new seedlings pushing through soil, "power isn't always about who carries the badge." Emily glanced at her. "And it's not always about who holds the microphone either." They shared a brief, understanding smile. The plane was gone now, dismantled and removed piece by piece. The field still bore scars, but green was already reclaiming brown. That was the shift no one televised. Not the crash, not the cuffs, the growth afterward. Because the real consequence of that day wasn't charges or headlines. It was a reminder, spoken through static and smoke, that ordinary people sometimes stand at the intersection of silence and action. And what they choose in that moment doesn't just shape outcomes, it reshapes assumptions.